Guru Nation, welcome to episode 261 of Random Musings from the Clinical Trials Guru. We've been busy. I apologize for not doing this many podcasts lately. We've had a full week of students here. We've had this book come out in the last 2 weeks. It's been selling better than I expected. The paperback's out, the Comprehensive Guide to Clinical Research. The Kindle is out. The audiobook is currently being approved by Audible, which is Amazon, so that should be out soon. And the audiobook, by the way, I think is our best one because we read this book, but then we stop almost after every paragraph and go off script and discuss the topic deeper, kind of like this podcast is, but the podcast version of this book with the book as well. And I know, myself included, a lot of people like to listen to books as opposed to reading them. I do both, but I think you should actually get both. I don't think it would hurt you if you got both, the paperback or the Kindle, and then the audiobook, because it's like two different books almost. All right, so I wanted to talk about something. I wanted to dive deep into a topic, and I stumbled upon this hypothesis recently. I've been able to, as I'm helping people get into the industry, people that want to be CRAs, people that want to be coordinators, people that want to start their own sites, just a very general sense of the term, I'm helping people get into the industry. I've recently come to the realization that this industry is just a collection of different verticals of hyper-specialists. And that's not necessarily wrong. I mean, you need that. You need people specializing in oncology. You need people who know what they're doing to be monitors. You need people who know what they're doing to be coordinators. You need PIs focused on patient safety and their particular therapeutic indications. You need vendors to create EDCs. You need trial master file vendors. You need IRBs. You need all these specialists. Yes, nobody is in disagreement there. But what we also need in this industry, which we're lacking, is cohesion amongst those groups, right? How do we integrate all these stakeholders, all these different verticals? Because yeah, we have the sites, we have the CROs, we have the sponsors, we have the vendors, and then you take any of those groups that I mentioned. Let's go with the sites, right? You have PIs, you have coordinators, you have research assistants, you have patient recruiters. Let's go with the CROs. You have CRAs, you have project managers, you have in-house CRAs, you have regulatory affairs, pharmacovigilance. There's, even within those verticals of the sites, the CROs, the sponsors, and the vendors, you have further specialization within those vendors. So you have people at the site level, maybe they're recruiting patients, that have no idea what it's like to be a study coordinator. But what's even more unbelievable to think about is you have CRAs that are monitoring studies that have no idea what challenges sites have and sites face on a daily basis. None. They know nothing. Many CRAs don't know almost anything about what it takes to keep a site running, right? And vice versa. Coordinators don't know very much, if anything, about what it's like to be a CRA, what kind of pressures they're under. Oftentimes, I know that this was the case for me. When I was a study coordinator, I used to think that when my monitors were requesting things of me, I didn't know there was such thing as a database lock. I mean, I heard of it, but I didn't understand the kind of pressures they were under. So I just thought that my CRA was being extra annoying for whatever particular reason. I didn't realize that they are getting tremendous pressure from their project manager or their lead CRA and the sponsor for getting queries answered. I just thought they were trying to give me a hard time. And that's just one example. This is going on constantly, right? Constantly. Don't even get me started about any of these stakeholders understanding what the patient has to deal with on a daily basis. The closest ones are the sites, and they should be. They're the ones interacting with the patients. But the ones designing the study, the sponsors, and the ones managing or helping the sponsors, CROs, are clueless. So we have all these verticals with specialists. Some of these big CROs, you should see how hyper-specialized they get. I mean, they're trying to streamline everything, and they have specialists for specialists. It's not just one thing to be a CRA. Now you have an in-house CRA. You have an assistant to a CRA. You have a clinical trial administrator. You have, there's all kinds of stuff. Just go on Indeed and look at how hyper-specialized these things get. That's good and bad. The good is, could be more streamlined. The bad is, nobody knows what their other stakeholders in the process of clinical research are dealing with. And because of that, they have unrealistic expectations when they start something. Literally every clinical trial is over budget and under enrolling. Almost every single one. In the book, we have the exact number. I can't remember. Get the book and figure it out. Literally every single one, right? And that's because of a lot of things. It's because the sites overestimate, or maybe they just want to get the study because they're needing that study to have the opportunity to generate cash flow to stay in business or gain market share, right? But then you have the sponsors who believe what the sites tell them, and they've started taking it with a grain of salt, but even then, they underestimate how difficult it is, not just to recruit. Recruitment is sort of like the overarching theme of where most of these problems, most of these inefficiencies are most evident to anyone who's paying attention. But something as simple as an e-diary for a patient, right? I just had this example this week. Sites, if you work at a site for any amount of time, you know how cumbersome and how tedious some of these e-diary systems are for the patients, right? They're also known as patient-reported outcomes, but electronic patient-reported outcomes. Sponsors, they want the e-diaries or the e-pros because they get real-time data. No one's going to argue with that. Of course it's better. Sites don't like it because now they have to babysit their patients and remind their patients, because usually these e-diaries or e-pros, because the patients get to take them home, get to take the machine or the device home with them, they're now expected to enter more entries. And if they don't, it's now a protocol deviation. See, in the past, when you had patient-reported outcomes with paper, plain old-fashioned paper, right, the subjects would come in, they would answer a survey or a diary on paper, and the assessment was done. Very rarely was the patient not compliant because the site is there to remind them. Well, when you give the site an e-diary to give to the patient, and now you expect the site to follow up with that patient every morning and every evening, which is what most of these diaries call for, in order to maintain compliance with the protocol, you're asking the site to do a lot more work than they used to have to do when it came to just the plain old-fashioned paper surveys. What are we seeing? We're seeing more deviations. We're seeing more patients dropping out because they can't be compliant with the study. And the sponsors, what started out as something that is going to help them analyze the data quicker, which it does, is worse off almost. You can argue. I mean, someone should do a study on this. Is the industry better off with e-diaries or worse off? Now, hopefully, things like Alexa, which I start talking right now, it's probably going to turn on. There are people building e-pros, patient-reported outcomes, on things like Alexa. Who knows if that's going to work or not? The burden's still going to be on the sites to make sure that the patients are being compliant with the study. This is just another example of how people from the sponsor and CRO level can get so hyper-specialized, and they get tunnel vision, right? All they hear is data analytics. I want better data analytics. And that's fine. But what gets lost in the mix is, what is the site going to have to do now? The site is going to have to do more work, and it's not the site, it's the coordinator that's going to have to do more work, take more time out of his or her day to follow up with the patient and make sure that they're filling out this e-diary, because most patients forget. right? So the expectations are a little unrealistic. Hopefully technology can get better and more seamless, maybe with apps, maybe with voice, but we're not there yet, right? Right now, we're at a stage where sites and CROs, there's just a tremendous disconnect between what a CRO or a sponsor thinks is a great idea and what a site actually thinks is a great idea. Another thing is eSource. Now, there are some vendors, I use one, that is very site friendly. It's built for sites. But there are other eSource where the sponsors are creating more problems for the sites. Risk-based monitoring is another thing, right? Risk-based monitoring was a huge buzzword topic, trending topic in 2016, 2017. It's died down a little. I'm monitoring, and I'm only on one study that has risk-based monitoring, and I'm monitoring 4 studies. Only one of them is using risk-based monitoring. So risk-based monitoring is going to become more and more prevalent in the future, in my opinion. But it's based on, again, another assumption that all these technologies are eventually going to make life easier maybe for the site, which in turn will make it easier for the CRAs, and the sponsors can get data quicker. Right now, that's not the case because everyone's a specialist and nobody knows what the other people are expecting of them, or nobody even is on the same page when it comes to expectations. And I mean, patient recruitment, that's like the biggest obstacle, right? But patient compliance in the protocol, which I just explained with the e-diaries, is another example of the disconnect that comes when people specialize too much. Then you get more into the human elements of CRA-CRC relationships. That CRA study coordinator relationship is probably the most underrated but most important dynamics in the industry. It literally jeopardizes lives of patients, not just study participants, but patients after a drug is approved, right? And money, like big time. If you don't have a strong relationship between your CRA and CRC, you run the risk of slower studies because the coordinators, for whatever reason, is not going to enter the data as quickly as the sponsor would like. Even worse, if you have a confrontational relationship between CRA and a coordinator, you're going to have a coordinator that's just not going to screen anymore. And yes, it's the PI's decisions, but if a PI has plenty of studies and kind of leaves everything on autopilot for the coordinator to decide what studies to prioritize, which a lot of these PIs do, if that coordinator doesn't like the CRA, they're probably just going to enroll in another study because they don't want it. They know that if they enroll more patients in this study, that CRA is going to come more frequently. And if they don't like that CRA, they have an incentive not to enroll in that study unless that PI is prioritizing that study, which sometimes happens, but sometimes doesn't. You'd be amazed how often that doesn't happen and how much of the responsibility is given to the coordinator. And then sponsors don't understand this stuff. They just send CRAs out without hiring for empathy, which I think is going to be something that sponsors are going to start hiring for because it's going to affect the bottom line. It's going to affect enrollment. It's going to affect data. It's going to affect the data integrity. It's going to affect all kinds of things that are important in clinical research. That's the most important dynamic. I think we're going to do an entire webinar on that topic, the CRA-CRC dynamic, but there's so many other examples of this in the industry, like even PI coordinator, right? You can take the CRA-CRC dynamic. You can argue the CRA doesn't understand what a coordinator's day is like unless they were a coordinator before. And you can argue that a coordinator doesn't understand what a CRA goes through unless they were a CRA before, which is not the case usually. So CRAs, if they've never been coordinators, they don't have the slightest idea what it's like working at that site, juggling a whole bunch of studies, dealing with patients, patients rescheduling, trying to enroll patients, trying to keep them in the studies, dealing with multiple monitors, dealing with PIs who sometimes have unrealistic expectations of their coordinators. We see this happen all the time with coordinators and with burnout, just like with CRAs and their lead CRAs and burnout, right? Unrealistic expectations. Sometimes the PI knows that their coordinator is overworked, but that's just how they run their business. Most of the time, that's not the case. Most of the time, the PI has no understanding or just a very shallow understanding of what it's like to actually coordinate a trial, right? Same thing with the lead CRA and the CRA. Sometimes they know that they're overworking their CRAs. Other times, the lead CRA forgets, or maybe they've never done risk-based monitoring, or maybe they've never worked with a study with e-diaries or multiple different lab vendors, and you have to track all these vendors or PK samples and different things like that. Like, the studies are getting more complex, and because of that, all companies, all stakeholders are hiring more and more specialists to streamline everything, but that's creating a greater disconnect among stakeholders. And I think there's an opportunity for somebody out there. No one's going to hire a generalist, right? Nobody cares. You're not that special. No one's going to hire you just because you're cool. You're going to have to start most likely somewhere as a specialist. If it's at the site level, most likely it's going to be at a patient recruiter level, a research assistant level. If it's at the CRO level, you're probably going to start as an in-house CRA, trial master file specialist, right? Even the title itself says specialist, right? Regulatory specialist. A lot of our students go on to get these jobs, our students from the CRA Academy. That's great. You need to get started somewhere. The thing is, if you don't want to pigeonhole yourself and you want to create an abundance of opportunities for yourself, I don't care where you are and where you work, you need to learn all aspects. I'm pointing back to the book. This is why we wrote the book. We wrote the book for entry-level people. We wrote the book for relatively novice people. But what we've realized in our years of running the CRA Academy, running site consulting services, running a CRO, now starting to dabble in some sponsor side stuff, we interact with different stakeholders from different verticals, and they're talking completely different language, right? Sponsors are looking at data analytics. Sites are looking at budgets, inclusion, exclusion criteria, and how many patients they can get. Completely different. Same clinical research, right? That's the topic. Completely different things they're concerned about. Right, so we thought this book would be a good idea for people to learn about what the other stakeholders are dealing with, even if it's just on a surface level. You can go learn a little bit about what a site's dealing with, what a CRA is dealing with if you're a coordinator, what a sponsor is dealing with, vice versa, and then go dig deeper, because we tried to keep the book as concise as possible. It's 200 pages. The audiobook's good too because we go off script a lot. I've realized that the danger of specializing is you're going to learn more and more about a topic until there's nothing left to learn, or it becomes obsolete. That's obviously not a good position to be in if you're an employee. That's obviously not a good position to be in if you're a site that just gets more and more specialized. You want to actually start, you're going to have to start as a specialist somewhere. You're going to have to expand horizontally, not just vertically. Right? Vertically means getting more and more and more and more specialized, getting more and more in-depth knowledge and specific knowledge. That's great. But then once you master it, once you've kind of reached the point where there's a diminishing returns now, and you got to figure where that's at, you should expand horizontally. You should go into another area and say, okay, what can I learn here? And this is good for you if you're running a business. This is good for you if you're trying to grow your career, right? And with sponsors as well. I mean, there's a lot more to being a sponsor, a successful sponsor, than just designing a protocol and then finding sites to do the protocol, right? You have a lot of these big sponsors now. They're getting the patients more involved, the whole e-patient movement. They're understanding this. They're understanding that if they can get patients the stakeholder, that's another stakeholder we're barely even talking about. If we get the patient to collaborate with the sponsor on designing a protocol that other patients could be compliant with, right? That's a good thing for the industry. So sponsors are starting to do these things. Sponsors were trying to do preferred sites. Some are still doing it. Some CROs are still doing it. That was their attempt to expand horizontally and understand more of the stakeholders' problem. That's why some conferences are good. That's why we're trying to put on a conference ourselves. We want to bring the different stakeholders together and have a discussion, a real discussion about what's important to you, stakeholder A, stakeholder B. How can we work together? Where can we find that magic space where we're getting what we need and you are too, right? And then getting rid of the stuff that doesn't matter or the stuff that is not going to advance our cause. So just something I wanted to, I don't know if it's a rant or a podcast episode, but I wanted to just go a little more in depth on hyper-specializing in this industry, the dangers of that, but it's also a good thing to have hyper-specialists, but it's also a very bad thing. Just like most things in life have pros and cons, this is one where the stakes are super high. I mean, we're talking about healthcare. We're talking about people's lives. Stakes are super high. There's just a lot of bureaucracy. There's a lot of specialists that don't understand what the other stakeholder is working on, yet they have to collaborate. I mean, it's a lot to process. We didn't even get into the vendors, IRBs, EDC vendors. We talked a little bit about eSource, patient recruitment. There's a lot. So, yes, you're most likely a specialist. Yes, it's probably in your best interest to continue to be a specialist while gaining more experience laterally, horizontally, in another area, right? And then combining your expertise from both fields and then become a specialist in that vertical and then become a specialist in another vertical. Integrate it all, right? That's what we need more of in this industry. It's a lot of work. Very few will be willing to do it, but it's what the industry needs, and it's a tremendous opportunity for individuals, companies, consortiums. A lot of opportunities there. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.